Hello, I am very excited to be here with you talking about the histories of childhood and youth in Latin America with people who teach children and youth. And I also just want to thank you so much for the work that you do as educators, especially during this last incredibly challenging year and a half. So my name is Leigh Campoamor. I'll introduce myself a little and give you some context for the topic of my talk today. I'm an anthropologist whose research focuses on the everyday lives of kids who work in Lima, Peru, particularly as they navigate the global and local efforts to eradicate child labor that, of course, we're all familiar with. The kids in my research work in a range of different activities. This includes street-based pursuits such as juggling for at intersections, as you can see here in the bottom right image. Also washing windshields, selling candy on public buses or on the streets. And also a lot of the kids worked in family-based businesses, such as juice carts and popsicle selling outside of their homes. I also include in my definition of work non-remunerated home-based work within their own family, within children's families, such as sibling care and cooking. Some of the kids that I worked with traveled quite a distance within the city from where they live in the sort of outskirts of the city, in the shanty towns, to more central commercial areas in order to work. Some worked alongside their parents and some did not. So I distinguish my ethnographic research through its child-centered approach, which means that I privilege the ideas and experiences of children in my research. And my main way of doing research is by hanging out with kids themselves. Typically, I wait to do interviews until I've established a pretty solid relationship with them. My research, primarily the research that constitutes the basis for the book that I'm currently writing, primarily took place between 2006 and 2008, but I've been doing this research more generally since the early 2000s, and my relationship with a lot of the children in my research continues. There's actually a longitudinal element to my book that goes back to these same children 10 years later as they navigate young adulthood. My research has also involved conducting interviews with and shadowing the staff of different institutions that work with children, including state agencies and NGOs. I got involved in this topic more than 20 years ago when I was attending an NGO conference in Lima and on children's rights, and was surprised to see that in the mix of all of the adult presenters, there was one group of teenagers presenting. They introduced themselves as representatives from Peru's national movement of working children. And in the hour that they very eloquently spoke about the need to challenge adult centrism and recognize children as political actors, they completely challenged the way that I understood childhood and the world more broadly. The two speakers, Yulisa and Julio, explained that the social movement that they belonged to, the National Movement of Working Children, argues for the right of children to work under dignified conditions. And this is a position that they call the critical valuation of child labor, but that they explained that the often well-intentioned anti-child labor children's rights interventions ignore children's agency and the structural position from which poor families need to make decisions about working. So I just want to be really clear that they distinguish between the critical valuation of children's work and exploitation, and these children condemn exploitation. in every form. So I'm happy to answer questions about that in the next session about the ways that they differentiate between exploitation and dignified work. So basically this is just to kind of give you some context that in a short amount of time, these young people began to challenge the biases that I didn't even realize that I had, in particular with regard to questions of child labor and children's rights. And that was the beginning of a long research project that continues to this day, and also a long-term relationship with this movement and with other children who work on the streets and with their families who are not part of the movement. So today I have been tasked with talking about histories of childhood and youth in Latin America. I'm excited to do this because over the course of my research, I realized that in order to understand contemporary experiences and debates, and in particular, why certain well-meaning rights-based interventions often end up perpetuating harm, including violence against families, it's crucial that we go back a few centuries. I want to be clear that I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to be giving you a comprehensive chronology of childhood in Latin America, but what I want to do is set the basis for the ways that certain institutions and understandings of childhood arose in the colonial period, and then discuss how this knowledge can inform the way that we approach childhood in Latin America today. And again, of course, during our interactive session together, we can delve into this a lot further. So some of the key themes and topics that I want to cover today is just the idea that childhood is a historical invention. It's not something that has always existed as a distinct category. Childhood is a diversely lived experience. And this goes for within Peru or within Latin America. Childhood is a diversely lived experience. There's not just one kind of Latin American childhood, one kind of Peruvian childhood, just like there isn't one kind of childhood experience in the United States. So, you know, I'll of course have to make certain generalizations during this presentation, but I in no way want to present childhood as a monolithic thing in Latin America. Also, very important, understandings of childhood are linked to racism and white supremacy. And this is, I think, something that I would, you know, that we can also think about a lot in relation to the United States. Policies and actions taken in the interest of children are often rooted in histories of social control, economic oppression, and cultural erasure, even when they're well-intentioned. And also, it's important to understand the history of childhood to understand the world more broadly. We can, to some extent, like any category of analysis, we can isolate it only to a certain extent because childhood only has meaning in relation to the world more broadly, other identifications, and at the same time, our understanding of the world isn't complete without an understanding specifically of childhood. So I want to just begin by flagging certain methodological challenges in studying the history of childhood. There isn't a comprehensive body of literature on the history of childhood in Latin America or really anywhere. Often children get talked about indirectly through discussions about family, for example. So this is a challenge that historians of childhood come up against, that there really isn't a lot to go on. Children did not leave written records. Right? And the records that exist that regard children often reflect elite perspectives. Going along with this, literature that we find, historical literature we find about children is often more prescriptive than descriptive. That is, it describes how, prescribes how childhood should be, often referring both implicitly and explicitly to an ideal sort of childhood that other childhoods are measured against. And I'll be introducing certain historical sources during this talk, including art, court records. And I also want to flag, when I talked about elite perspectives, some of the very first records about childhood, or what we might now call childhood, in colonial Peru were written from the perspectives of explorers and missionaries. So of course, these people who were coming from Europe. So of course, these people had very particular worldviews with which that they were bringing with them to describe what the indigenous societies that they encountered. Again, so you kind of see the bias there. All right. So, so I'm gonna talk for a while about colonialism, specifically the arrival of the Spanish in what is presently Peru. I'm focusing on this location, not just because my research focuses on Peru, but also because Lima, the capital of Peru, was the capital of Spain's South American empire. So if you look at the map on the left is a current map of South America, and Peru is this area in red. And Lima is right here on the coast, sort of midway down. These are other countries, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, right? And so the red is Peru. Then if you look at the map on the right, this is a map of the conquest of Peru in 1542. So what constituted Peru during at this moment was this entire area outlined in red. So I don't know how clear it is on the screen, but that includes this green area, this red area, and this yellowish area, right? This entire landmass over here is Brazil, and so that was part of the Portuguese Empire. So Peru was this entire area here, and Lima was the capital of this this area, and therefore, and it was the capital of the Peruvian the Spanish viceroyalty in South America. And of course, in order to when the Spanish decided to make Lima their capital, Lima was a pretty empty coastal desert town. Of course, the Inca Empire, which they had to conquer, was based in Cusco, which was further. It was in the mountains in the Andes mountain range over here. Okay. So some general points about colonialism. As always, colonialism combines physical violence and exploitation with social control and cultural domination. Within this system, children are seen as malleable subjects. That is, beings in the making who can be molded into productive subjects in the system, right? And this is, I would say, a general characteristic of colonialism worldwide, although it played out differently in different places. So bringing this a little bit closer to home, I assume that many of you have been following the recent discovery of the unmarked graves of hundreds of Native American children from residential schools in Canada. These were state-run and religious boarding schools that existed in Canada until the late 1990s in order to assimilate Indigenous children into so-called Western culture. Well, the same kinds of schools were prevalent in the United States. And I present to you here a quote from Colonel Richard Platt. I'm sorry, this is not from Colonel Richard Platt. This is from John B. Riley, an Indian school superintendent. In 1886, he said, and of course, this is the language that he uses is racist. Education affords the true solution to the Indian problem. The boarding school is the very key to the situation. However excellent the day school may be, is to a great extent offset by the habits, scenes, and surroundings at home. Only by complete isolation of the Indian child from his savage antecedents can he be satisfactorily educated. And on the right here, we have a sort of before and after picture that was taken of students who were brought to one of these schools, Native students who had their hair cut and were forced to undergo these programs of assimilation. In Latin America, the situation was, there was a different, this sort of re-education was achieved in a different way. It wasn't achieved through these sorts of residential schools. It was instead achieved by placing indigenous children in the homes of elite families as laborers. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I really just wanted to emphasize, I want to draw these parallels to emphasize certain commonalities in the efforts to quote unquote civilize indigenous populations by intervening in the education of children, and how this is rooted in a common ideology of white supremacy that undergirded colonialism and whose legacies continue to this day. Okay. So I want to talk then about the cultural aspect of colonial domination and how children fit into this. So when the Spanish arrived in present-day Peru and encountered the Incan Empire, there was, of course, a cultural clash in the way that the two different cultures understood childhood. So Incans understood childhood in relation to their, or really categorized humans more generally in relation to their physiological abilities, their usefulness. Whereas the Spanish conceptualized childhood as a mental state marked by irrationality, right? And adulthood was a state marked by rationality. And for this, I'm going to use a few different images that, and draw on a discussion by Carolyn Dean, an art historian, who talked about this sort of cultural clash that occurred when, in relation to conceptions of childhood. So these images are authored by Felipe Guamampoma de Ayala, who was an Incan elite that lived from 1534 to 1615, and wrote and illustrated an almost 200-page chronicle that was a documentation of Incan culture and also a critique of Spanish rule and the way that and the effects that the Spanish conquest and subsequent colonialism had on Incan culture. And what we can learn from his chronicle, one of the sections is devoted to the different ages of life. And so he illustrates that people who were less than 1 year old, and really people who up to about 5 years old, were cared for by others, right? They were seen as they didn't have purpose or usefulness. So here we see sort of a swaddled infant on the left, right? Boys and girls ages 5 through 9 were separated in terms of what they did, the sort of productive activities they were involved in, but they were both involved in different productive activities. Boys aided their parents in the community by watching over young siblings, by performing domestic chores, helping to raise orphans. Girls aged 5 to 9 were pages for important women. They helped parents by collecting firewood and straw, doing spinning, gathering edible plants, taking care of younger children, fetching water, cooking, cleaning. And so children became part of society by working for the community. Here we see a girl of 12 years old herding animals. And then here we see a messenger of 18 years old. So in what the other thing that we notice here is that there's no real distinction between work and education. They were one and the same thing. Now, I also want to address, I just want to flag that there were distinctions within Incan society. It was also a hierarchical society, so not all children were necessarily treated and seen equally. There is also a record of certain pre-conquest practices of children being used in human sacrifice. So there's a lot to be said here, and I'm sort of condensing it down and focusing on this cultural clash. The Spanish, like I said, their conception of childhood was based on mental state, one's mental state, the idea that children were irrational. And what the art historian Carolyn Dean looks at here to illustrate this, and I'm just showing one of many examples, is a series of paintings that were done in Cusco were in the early 17th century, the late 17th century, of the Corpus Christi procession, which was an important Catholic procession. Of course, Catholicism was brought in by the Spaniards. And the point that Dean makes is that in these different paintings, we see people separated according to their caste. And I will talk a little bit later about the caste system, which was a racialized and class system of hierarchical system, of course, like of domination. And so we see that in this plane, in the center plane, we see people who are white and who are the characteristics of people associated with whiteness. And then in the bottom plane, we see a mix of indigenous and Afro-descendant people. We also see children mixed in the bottom plane, children of different racial categorizations. And what we see here, and I can't really, I doubt you can make it out, but right here, and then this is a little bit closer, you see a child acting silly, right? He has a pea shooter in his mouth and he's pointing it at somebody. And what Dean argues that this illustrates, again, in relation to a broader collection of paintings of this sort, is that the children were associated with, the lower castes and as irrational people, right? And these were meant to, who didn't behave properly according to adult norms in colonial society. And so these paintings were meant to serve a pedagogical function where that taught the lower classes how to behave more rationally. Again, children were sort of a stand-in for the general idea that that lower caste people, racialized people, were irrational and were likened to children. And so we see this more broadly throughout the colonial period in terms of the infantilization of indigenous and Black adults, right? The idea that these adults, that indigenous and Black adults, and of course, when the Spanish first arrived in Cusco, it was indigenous adults as having a different worldview that the Spanish interpreted as irrational and therefore childlike. So the treatment of children and understandings of childhood and the ways that control was exerted over childhood is intimately linked to practices of racial domination. and the ways that non-white populations were attributed childlike status or infantilized. So in order to understand how childhood was organized in the colonial era, it's important to place it within the context of two broader and interrelated systems, one of which is patriarchy, and the other one, which I'll talk about afterwards, is the Casa system, which is basically a system of white supremacy. So patriarchy, a lot of us are familiar with hearing this to describe a male-dominated society, or a society organized around male power. Now, the historian Bianca Premo provides us with a more specific definition regarding colonial Peru. She defines patriarchy as colonial practices based on the belief that multiple individuals, male and female, young and old, were naturally subordinate to an authority figure, usually a male, who held superiority based on the hierarchical model of the Western family. Premo does archival research of court records in colonial Lima and shows that under colonial rule, the family was understood as a microcosm of the colony at large. And so the authority of the father figure, the male head of the home, the patriarchal authority, was supposed to mirror the authority of the king, the supreme leader, right, over his subjects. So this was the basis for patriarchy. And so what's important then to recognize is that patriarchy is a system that is about gender, but it's also about generation and about race and about class. And the way that colonial subjects were kept in line was through submission to a patriarchal figure. Within this system, there are two legal constructs that I want to emphasize. One is the concept of patria potestad, which it's a legal term derived from Roman, and it refers to a father's legal authority over his family, including children. And a thing that's important to note here is that mothers under this system of governance had no legal authority over their children. Okay, and this was something that was kept in practice even after independence, and that I would argue has significant ramifications today. So patria potestad, father's legal authority over their family, and this excluded women from having any sort of authority over their children. The other category is the term minor, which is, we often think about this term as synonymous with childhood, a child or someone here in the US, an individual who's below 18 years of age. Although in practice, it was a very flexible term that didn't just include children, but also indigenous adults, enslaved adults, servants, all people that were associated with the irrationality ascribed to children that I described earlier. So basically the notion of minor served the broader patriarchal system of power in ways that, like I said, didn't just involve generational differences, but also racial and class and gender differences. And it was one mode through which power was exercised over what were considered to be marginal populations. So the other system that I want to talk about that worked, of course, hand in hand with patriarchy was the Casa system, and which is basically a white supremacist system that children were key figures in this system. And so, so this is the image that I have here is a typography of the kinds of different kinds of racial mixing and the terminology that was given to children of different unions, right? Different mixed race unions, right? And so I'm not going to go through all of the categories here, but this classification of children according to the races of their parents was crucial for upholding the colonial hierarchy. And And this Casa system was embedded in ideology called limpieza de sangre in Spanish, which means purity of blood. And again, we've heard about this in relation to, in relation to the Holocaust. And this also is with different terminology underlies the system of race in the United States, right? And this is sort of the basis on which the United States was also founded. It was, the categorizations were done in different ways, but it was the same underlying ideology. And so what I just wanted to flag here again, that children were key figures in the system of racial classification and racial hierarchies. And now I'm going to talk about two different things, the concept of illegitimacy and the question of labor, in order to further, to kind of give some more concrete evidence of this. So in terms of illegitimacy, so illegitimacy refers to children who were born out of wedlock. And records of illegitimacy have historically been very high in Latin America. And so what's the laws and norms around illegitimacy were another way of enforcing racial hierarchies and exercising control over non-white children. So basically, because of the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, mixed race unions were frowned upon. But for many reasons that you can imagine that involved consensual and non-consensual sex, many white European men had children with indigenous and Black women throughout the Americas, right? Out of wedlock, right? And because of ideologies of white supremacy, these mixed race children were often not recognized by their fathers. And this was a practice that continued beyond the colonial period. So the thing, I talked earlier about patria potestad, right? The legal authority of fathers over his family, including children. But in this case, with illegitimate children, the law did not confer patria potestad to men who fathered illegitimate children. But here's the thing, like I said before, mothers didn't have patria potestad either. So basically, illegitimate children, who were mostly mixed race children, who were seen because they were seen as less desirable for a white man than a white child whose mother was of European descent. These mixed race children ended up not having a legal guardians, right? Or the mother, in a certain way, the mothers were considered to be their guardians, but not their parents, right? So what this did was, because mothers didn't have legal right to their children then, it meant the children were really vulnerable to be taken away from their mothers and put to work for other families in exploitative situations, right? And so a whole system of institutions developed around this that basically came up with different moral pretexts for taking children away from their mothers due to what was called moral abandonment, right? Which was a French legal term taken by the Spanish and imported in to the colonies. And these terms, such as moral abandonment, were used very liberally in relation to children of single mothers, again, as a pretext for children to be taken away and made to work for others. And this connects to the question of labor. So one way that children, so I had said earlier that the form of that re-education of indigenous children was not done through the same means as in the United States or in North America with indigenous boarding schools. Instead, it was children were sent to individual families and they were placed in what were called usually apprenticeships, but which amounted to basically exploitative labor relationships where children were providing labor for more elite families. And the idea behind this was that they were learning how to be proper subjects in a patriarchal society. So oftentimes, again, going back to the historian Bianca Premo, she calls these situations ones of surrogate patriarchy, where the father figure in these families that children were taken into were considered surrogate patriarchs by the law, right? And they employed these children and taught them sort of the idea that they taught them the norms of society. Oftentimes children were placed, again, they were called apprenticeships often because they were placed with tradespeople and so that they could learn a trade and continue to provide a supply of labor for the colony. But it's also important to note that the majority of young people who were put to work for other families were actually girls and young women who worked as domestic servants, doing household tasks such as childcare, washing, clothing, cooking. So this is an example of how patriarchy was upheld and how young people were subjected to a system of discipline that kept them in line, but also ensured their economic productivity without compromising the hierarchical class and race system, right, that they lived in. So again, another kind of something else that was developed during this time was anti-vagrancy laws, which ended up being basically existing until just a couple of decades ago, and the invention of youth deviance. So again, the vagrancy was also one of those very loose, had a very loose definition, right? And basically used to apply to anyone who was occupying urban space supposedly without engaging in a productive economic activity. And the quote unquote punishment for vagrancy was also placement in the sorts of apprenticeships that I was talking about and other sorts of exploitative work situations. Some of the most exploitative situations were bakeries especially in Lima that were known for having just terrible conditions. So just like moral abandonment, which was often gendered, used to sort of in relation to mothers, right? Vagrancy became a term that authorities could easily use to control lower caste youth. And it also set a precedent for considering the street to be an improper place for children, a place of contamination. There was this sort of panic that emerged in the media about wayward children who were occupying the street and who are going to be getting into trouble. So I hope that when I'm talking about all of this stuff, you're thinking also about how the contemporary resonances of these sorts of institutions and patterns and the ways that these things play out in the world today, in Latin America, and also again in the United States. There's other versions of the same kinds of patterns grounded in the same underlying ideologies. So these patterns, institutions, legal categories were carried into the post-independence period, is what I'm trying to say. When in the immediate post-independence period, colonial elites were basically transformed into national elites. So these systems that were developed centuries ago continue to influence the experiences of children in Latin America. And I want to also just make sure that it's clear that colonial history itself is not monolithic. So I was talking mostly about Peru just now. There are more nuanced ways of talking about what I did. And there's also, I also want to say that some of it, like when I was talking about illegitimacy, that is something that applied very broadly throughout Latin America. There's a lot of historical evidence of what I was talking about throughout all of Latin America and the Caribbean. So, and even within the colonial period, which lasted centuries, right, their ideas about the proper approach to children changed, right? For example, from a more punitive approach to an approach considered to be more educational and reformist, right? But when it comes down to it, these were all different strategies of control. So these are just some of the colonial legacies. The term public-private wasn't what was used during that time, but but sort of a lot of the regulation of space then became articulated in relation to the question of private and public later in the post-colonial period. Leave this here for a minute. So nation states started achieving independence in the early 1800s throughout Latin America. And like I said before, the white supremacist ideology that regarded indigenous people as a threat to the national order, these ideas continued to characterize nation building projects. Just skipping ahead a little bit to the early 1900s, during this period, different Latin American countries experimented with welfare state models. And there were specifically institutions developed that focused on the well-being of children. There were Pan-American congresses, different countries established children's codes. Brazil was the first country to establish a children's code in 1927. The focus, discussions about the importance of reform as opposed to punishment, but often this didn't end up playing out. Punishment was still and continues to still be widely used. In Brazil in particular, we hear terrible reports about police violence against street children, who again are mostly children of color. And of course we see, there's a lot to be said about the ways that the crisis of violence in Central America is linked to US military policies and the US militarization of Central American countries that then sort of, that have produced this crisis of gangs and other forms of political violence where children often become the targets. So, there's a lot to be thinking about here, and there's a lot of different, again, of nuances in different countries. But during this period, another thing I want to emphasize is that fathers' legal power was eventually sort of diminished in that, and mothers and states gained greater responsibilities towards children. In particular, there was during the late 19th, early 20th century, the Latin American version of eugenics took hold and combined with ideas about raising children and how to raise proper families. And the idea of puericulture, puericultura, meant educating mothers on hygienic ways of raising their children, took hold in Latin American countries. Again, very much linked into ideas of eugenics that were based in white supremacy, right? Limpieza de sangre, blood purity, that placed that saw mothers of indigenous and Black descent as being contaminants, right? Who needed to be sort of taught the proper ways of raising children, because otherwise they would sort of culturally contaminate their children. Public schooling also arose during this period, and yet ultimately sort of became a way of reproducing class and race inequalities, which again is something I'm really happy to talk about during the recitation. This is often, and I find in my own research that contemporary efforts to eradicate child labor are often placed, but they often assume that school and work are sort of mutually exclusive. and they place school as the important, the activity that children should be, education, school as the activity that children should be involved in, which of course, all of the children that I knew and their parents wanted that was a major priority of theirs to finish school, and most of them did finish school. But the fact of the matter is that because of the structural underpinnings of the public school system, graduating from high school in a public school in Peru does not ensure upward mobility. And so it's this idea that school is somehow the thing that's going to save children from poverty and allow them to achieve upward mobility is really a myth, and it's grounded in a myth of meritocracy. And countries in Latin America and the United States also are not meritocracy. So, and again, a lot of these efforts at reforming children really didn't, one way to look at it is that they failed. These institutions failed. They failed because they didn't have enough funding, these state institutions, but also they ended up being spaces, even when they did continue to function, they ended up being spaces that reproduced hierarchies. In many countries, orphanages continuing to function as workhouses. In Peru, when I was doing my field work, again, pretty recently, right? The youth jails were being used as spaces for so-called orphans. And I say so-called because, again, this idea of vagrancy is loosely applied. And children who worked on the streets were being rounded up and placed into jails. Okay. But I just want to leave this final slide up here to just help you think a little bit, again, in thinking ahead to our recitation session, contemporary issues that exist today that have colonial legacies. So I'll just leave this up here. And I want to end by making a distinction between two types of arguments. Or rather to sort of identify one kind of argument that I'm not trying to make, which is that I don't want to fall into a simple idea of cultural relativism, like, oh, we should go back to how it was before colonialism, indigenous culture. I don't think that, I think that point of view often implies a certain degree of romanticism, but also colonialism is part of the institutional structure of Latin American countries. And I think we need to have decolonization. We need to work towards decolonization. But at this point, that doesn't mean simply going back to some imagined way of how it was before, right? And for that reason, I think it's really important that we study the legacies of the colonial system and how they're ingrained into the fabric of everyday life. Among Latin American children and among the institutions that claim to serve these children. And these legacies of the colonial system include racial capitalism, neoliberalism, and these are structures that make it impossible for children to live up to the ideal kinds of childhoods that are outlined in children's rights, today's children's rights discourse. So thank you, and I look forward to talking to all of you.